Good morning. I'm going to share with you my art progress. Let's just dive into it. Usually at this point, I talk about what comics I was reading last night, and I try to say some intelligent or at least interesting things about them. But last night, I did not get very much reading done, and the reason for that is because I was working on these thumbnails. Well, these aren't even thumbnails yet. These are just rough ideas. We'll get to these rough ideas in a second. Let me just mention, I only got a few pages into this next chapter on the history of the comic strips. We are in the 1920s, and essentially, so we have daily comics that have been invented. The Sunday comics were seen for the whole family or for children. The dailies were mainly for the adults, and so the dailies tended to be about middle class uh, uh, situations, middle class of the 1910s and 1920s at this time period. This is when we have comics like Polly and Her Pals, Petey, Abby the Agent. That should be, I think that's Polly down there. Yeah. And the Gumps. I am not really familiar with these comics at all. I have heard some of their names before in books like this. But when we're talking about this time period, we need to remember that, most Americans still lived on farms or small towns. Radio wasn't really a big thing yet. I usually associate radio with the 1930s, maybe the late 1920s. I'd have to look that up. So these comics were, in some ways, a little bit like the soap opera of the day, kind of the melodrama of the day. Some of these smaller towns might have just had a small, a silent cinema. So these comics really fulfilled an important role at that time period. I really can't say a lot about them. The text is actually rather hard to read. You know, I sometimes disparage the bad handwriting of children today, but some of these professionals in the 1920s did not always have the best handwriting, although I think a lot of that might have had to do with the engraving process at the time. I'd probably have to do more research on that. I did find this one paragraph interesting. This talked about the guy who did the comic, The Gumps, and how he was making $100,000 a year in 1920s money. So yes, these comics were big money because this was the equivalent of the radio soaps or the TV soaps of the time. I would also point out that newspapers were very different back then. Newspapers are kind of funny because they used to be very adaptable. If we look at earlier newspapers, say around the turn of the century, these newspapers had often they had poetry, they had short stories, they had gossip sections. So they were doing things which we would now associate with journals and magazines, but also with social media. And of course, there were pulp magazines in the day, and in some ways, those pulps were a little bit like blogs in the sense of the reader interaction in the letters columns. So newspapers just did a lot more things than they did later on, and you had evening papers too. Um, in some ways, newspapers stopped evolving in the 1950s or 60s, but we're talking about newspapers later because the history of newspapers is, of course, important. Anyway, let's get into the progress. Yesterday, I finished the line work on the last few pages of this sketchbook. This is going to be my entry to the State Fair as an altered book. So, uh, there's the leprechaun. Well, the parade's over. They're heading towards the train station, and there is the leprechaun who is trapped in the bag, and that's where this book ends off. Um, and then I think it's going to take about a dozen more pages just to finish that story. Obviously, the judges won't see that, but just for my own benefit, I wanted to finish the story. So it's going to be a few more pages where they're in the train, and maybe we get to see some of the like the leprechaun and some of the aliens again. So I'm going to be spending the next few days sort of concluding that story. Now, these little roughs, I'll have to work on these roughs. Um, this is for a different uh, project. This is for this little sketchbook. This sketchbook I got for free from my local art store on my birthday, and I wasn't really sure what to do with it, so I thought this could just be kind of a practice painting thing. This paper wasn't really meant for painting. That's fine. This was a free little thing. So these papers, this is where I'm planning out this little book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ink this, do the line art for this. So this will be lined, and then this sketchbook will be finished, and this will be finished, and then I'm going to paint all of them at once. So I'm thinking I will finish the line art probably in early July, and then spend the rest of July painting these 3 sketchbooks. And at the end of July, I will have my entry finished for the state fair. And in case this doesn't work out, in case I think, oh, this wasn't very good, I do have a backup. This could be my backup entry. But the other thing is, doing all of this painting, I hope will inspire me, because I also want to enter a painting for the fair, and I don't know what that's going to be. So I'm hoping July, when I'm painting and working with colors and things like that, that something will come to me. So anyway, that is my progress. I will be working in this sketchbook for a few days, working on the line art, and I will keep you appraised as to what's happening. So I'll talk to you later. Farewell.